On September 1st, 1935, Seiji Ozawa was born in Mukden, Japanese-occupied Manchuria, today's Shenyang. He was named after two senior officers in the Kwantung Army, Seishiro Itagai and Kanji Ishihara. Both had a deep acquaintance with his family. Soon after he was born, his family moved to Beijing for his father's job, and he spent his whole childhood in Beijing before his elementary school. The family later moved back to Japan in 1942, before the eve of the Pacific Warfare. This is also the time he began his training in piano and classical music. Being raised in a Christian household, his mother made him and his three brothers sing hymns at home and at church. After he entered middle school, he and his schoolmates organized a choir for singing hymns, which he regarded as the starting point of his conducting career. However, it was not until his last year of middle school, when he broke two of his fingers in a rugby game, that forced him to switch from studying piano to conducting. He studied under Saito Hideo, a maternal relative, in the Toho Gakugen School of Music until 1958, and left for France to advance his musical education the next year. In the same year, he won the bass con competition as the only Japanese among nearly 60 participants. He later moved to Berlin to continue his study and met both of his future mentors, Herbert von Karajan and Leonard Bernstein, who made him his assistant with the New York Philharmonic in 1961.
Here is Seiji Ozawa.
However, his journey was not all glamorous. While he was back in Japan in 1962, his blunt and open way of communication offended the Japanese musicians and were deemed as too Western and lacked humility, which resulted in him standing on an empty podium without an orchestra, and the incident made him focus on his work in America. This is not the only challenge he faced. During the early stages of his career, he had been frequently questioned of his ability in understanding Western classical music. Given his Oriental background, though he had eventually gained his reputation, prejudice was still prevalent in the community.
Was it the last year we had together here?
2 years. I'm trying to think.
Remember that the discussion about whether an Oriental can do Western music?
Oh, God. Music can be learned really by anybody who cares to know it well enough and deeply enough, and given the talent, they can do it. I know from my own family, which is very Oriental.
Yeah.
Very, extremely Oriental. And I know from visiting Japan or going into an Oriental cultures, and you feel, I know exactly why people act the way they do. Conforming there is more important than being an individual. That becomes hard when you have a talent.
That's right.
But when I'm outside of an Oriental culture, you have to speak up. You have to say that, I have an opinion. But when I'm in the Orient, I'm not supposed to have an opinion because well, I try to respect, the
Can you do
differences.
that? This question is very serious to me. That's.
Well,
I hope you're not. This is very private. Very private.
Okay, we'll stop the camera.
To summarize Seiji Ozawa's identity, he was a Japanese born in China, raised a Christian, and worked in a field dominated by Europeans and Americans. He found himself stuck in between the cultures and came to recognize that in order for Oriental musicians to catch up with the Western counterparts, they would have to learn the passion of music and let go of the Oriental culture of conformity before individuality. The experience had led him to dedicate much of his time in nurturing musicians from the Orient, including Chinese. After Mao's death and the demise of the Gang of Four in 1976, Seiji was invited to China in November the same year. Then, he went to visit the Central Philharmonic and saw the conservatoires of Beijing and Shanghai. He noticed that they only performed Chinese repertoire, as the Western scores were destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. He then told himself that he would come back to China with his own repertoire, which happened 2 years later in 1978. As we can see in the footage, this time he got the chance to conduct the Chinese Central Philharmonic Orchestra, performing Chinese pieces like The Heroic Little Sister on the Grassland, as well as Western scores by conductor like Brahms. Ozawa spent the majority of his time rehearsing and guiding the musicians on understanding the pieces, filling the gap in musical knowledge left by the revolution. He was very eager to share his knowledge and educate the Chinese. He even mentioned that he dreamt of leading the Boston Symphony Orchestra to China to perform a joint concert with the Chinese Philharmonic Orchestra. His dream is once again realized.
I was music director of Boston Symphony. I was there 29 years, a long time, but that was earlier time. And our American Jimmy Carter, president, invited Deng Xiaoping to come to Washington. And the end of ceremony, both presidents announced some future plan. And Deng Xiaoping said, we start cultural exchange. And he will send the Beijing Opera, and he wanted to invite Boston Symphony and Seiji Ozawa. I had a cold that day. I had a temperature. I was my bedroom in Boston, and I was watching this, and I had a shock. Wow! Because
you didn't know?
I didn't. I asked. I wanted to go. This Huang Seme knew I wanted to come with the American orchestra, but I mean, it's no relation with two countries, yet. That is very, very beginning. So almost everybody said, oh, not possible. But that moment became possible.
C 小调第5交响曲，作曲贝多芬。
This was the last piece performed jointly by the two orchestras at the final concert. At the same concert, the Chinese orchestra accompanied Joseph Silverstein, the Boston Symphony concertmaster, in the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto, while the Boston Symphony in turn accompanied Mr. Liu Haide in the Pipa Concerto. As there was no concert halls in China at the time, the Boston Symphony and the Central Philharmonic of Peking shared the stage in the 18,000-seat Capitol Stadium in Beijing. As we can see, prominent figures like Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping and Madame Song Qingming was present at the concert. On top of that, Ozawa returned with a supply of scores, records, books, tapes, manuscript paper, strings, mouthpiece, and even blueprints for the construction of concert halls. The Boston Symphony Orchestra was the first American orchestra to be invited after the full resumption of the US-China diplomatic relations, and the second to visit China after the Philadelphia Orchestra in 1973. They were scheduled for 7 days in total in Shanghai and Beijing, including free concerts and closer interactions with Chinese musicians. During his stay, Ozawa taught conducting masterclasses for students in the Central Conservatory of Music by coaching the students with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and even scouted some young talents with potentials. His devotion in reconstructing Western classical music in China was witnessed by the Chinese. This explained his popularity in China. At the time, even those that did not care about classical music was aware of such a figure with fuzzy hair. Throughout the year, he came to China almost once every year until his health condition no longer allowed him to do so. He gives out classes and picked many Chinese students to study and practice under him. Though he had passed away earlier this year, on February the 6th, his significant contribution in the progress of Western classical music in China and the stories told about him made him an endearing figure in the mind of Chinese, even as the diplomatic relationship of China with the US and Japan shift in the recent decade.